Now you know it.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Stewart, for those of you who don't know me. How many of you are new for the first time here? Welcome, welcome, glad to have you here. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Braintree for the wonderful dinner we had. It's very unexpected. I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements. I'm one of the coordinators here for Write the Doc San Francisco. Another one is Juan Lara, who's sitting here. We have a couple other people who are not here tonight, Sarah Day and Nico Boklan. They're also organizers for Write the Doc San Francisco. Our next meetup is on June 13th. We are doing a hackathon. We are writing a guide for people who are the sole writers at their company. So what we need are people who are sole writers at their company, people who've been sole writers at their company, and people who are really good at writing. That's everyone, right? And the idea is to break up some topics and ideas, things like if you inherited documentation that said, oh, say Word, is that really what you want to be authoring in? And what might be some choices you might make for a real authoring tool?
Nice.
An effective authoring tool that will fit in with your company. Or what are the top, let's say, 10 things you might want to have in a style guide? Bare bones style guide to decide so that it's something that's going to be pervasive, you're going to use as you write your document. Things like that. And once we create it, we'll probably open it up on Slack, let people who want to fill in some stuff can do that, and then we're going to give it to Write the Docs organization in Portland to put on their website. So it's mainly for, we have a lot of people here in San Francisco who are sole writers of their company. Maybe they're not even a real writer, maybe, I'm not, anyway. Maybe they're a writer, but they're not a formal technical writer. Maybe their real job is support, but they have to write docs also. Or maybe their real job is marketing, but they have to write the product documentation as well. So it's really for everyone who does writing. Also, one last thing. Can I? Yes. Yes. So we have a person here, people here from a company. They're going to be these two folks here. They're going to be in the back after our in the kitchen after our meetup, who are looking to hire some people. And so if you are looking to hire, meet up back in the kitchen. If you need a job, meet up back in the kitchen. If you know someone who's looking for a job, meet up back in the kitchen after the discussion so that you guys can network and get together. And can I ask you to stand up? I want to show off her t-shirt. This is the Write the Doc San Francisco t-shirt that we have been trying to sell to raise money. It has a cat on it. And we're going to have other designs later, but for right now, our very own Nico produced this design for us, and it's on sale. So after the, it's $20. After the meetup presentation, I will run my slides, which has the website and everything, if you want to. So with that, I'm going to introduce Kristof and let him talk.
That's great.
Yes.
Great pronunciation. Thanks. Hi. Yeah. So welcome. Before I get started, and before I introduce myself, I want to do something new. I heard this, there was somebody, I think at Write the Docs or at DevExCon who told me about someone who did who started their presentation with a thank you, because me being here means that I'm only here because I'm really privileged. And there's a whole lot of people that are back home, making money, taking care of our kids, Laura, my wife, and business partner. There's slides in this presentation and a lot of research that comes from another colleague. There's a whole bunch of people because of whom I can do what I'm doing here, and I wanted to call that out. That's it. So who am I? I'm Kristof Van Tomme. I'm a Belgian. I have a business together with my wife and a third partner in Hungary and Belgium. It's a little bit in both countries. And for the longest time, we were a Drupal agency. We just did Drupal websites until about 2 years ago when we bumped into this need for developer portals. And then we started specializing in developer portals. And a few months ago, we actually made the big jump and changed our website from Drupal agency to developer portal company, which is super exciting. And and one of the things that we've been doing different from other Drupal agencies or other agencies is that we've been going to a lot of different communities and collecting information, bringing it all together, digesting it, and sharing it back with the community. Because there's a lot of knowledge that's already out there. It's just very much distributed, and nobody knows everything. We definitely don't know everything, but we're trying to learn as much as possible and then to share it back. Is the sound okay for everybody? Yeah. Okay, good. So a little bit more. I also run the Write the Docs meetup group in London. I've also brought my colleagues in to help me with that. We're I don't know if you've heard of API the Docs. It's a dedicated API documentation event that we're starting up. It's a long story, but if you want more about that, I'll be handing out stickers after the talk, and Belgian chocolates. I should not take them back home. And these are the communities that I roam. So Drupal, DevRel, that was yesterday. Write the Docs, the Dita community also, because I know that some of you are Dita people. That's where I got started on Docs. I just love the structuredness of Dita, and I've never really done much with Dita. We've done a few projects where we import Dita in Drupal, but I've never written Dita. But somehow its structuredness is elegant and pleasing, so I go to a lot of their events also. And besides all this research, we're also working on an open source Drupal distribution for documentation that you can use to import documentation from GitHub repos, import Swagger and a bunch of other things, and combine it all into developer portals or other documentation portals. Now, with that all said, I'm going to make it a little bit higher. With that all said, why are developers important? I guess probably you haven't really thought about that, or maybe you did, but there's this big shift happening right now, and it's all about APIs. And basically what's happening, and you all know this because you're here, or probably, I don't know if anybody is new to the API space, or most of you are already so there's this whole big shift happening where more and more businesses are moving towards web APIs as a way to integrate with other companies, so that you can have automatic connections between businesses through API contracts, basically. And the thing is that it's the developers who choose what APIs get integrated. So if your documentation is crap, there's a really big chance that nobody's going to use your API. And it creates this really weird thing because in the past, most of the time, the people that would be making the decisions about what technology would be used for a product would often be C-level and nobody who actually was going to do the integration. But that's changed a lot. And today, a lot of the people that make decisions or that are very strong influencers for the decisions about what technology will be used and what product will be used are developers. And I call this an agency opportunity in contrast with an agency problem. Because actually this is an agency problem, right? Because developers are sitting in front of consumers and are deciding what API will get integrated and what API somebody downstream is basically going to be using all the time without really knowing that they're using it. There's a whole lot of ethical questions around that. But if we're talking from a purely business perspective, it's a huge opportunity because it means that if you have the best documentation in the industry, more people will use your API and your business is going to make more revenue. And that's what, for a lot of businesses, it's all about. Um, so, and developer experience, the experience of how to use an API is sometimes more important than costs even. And that's kind of crazy and weird. And that's why we're all here, because as documentarians, it's not always been very easy to explain why corporates should pay for us. And this is like, your docs are really important now. So, you should pay more money for the people that are writing your docs, and that's good for us. So, now what is a developer portal? For a lot of people, it's basically Swagger docs, just hashed through some pipeline, and ta-da, we have a portal. I argue that that's not true. I would argue that the reference docs, the API reference docs, is just a start for your developer portal. Because reference docs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, reference docs are troubleshooting guides. They're reference docs you need for the people that already know that they want to use your API, and they're probably already using your API, and now they need some extra help to do like the nitty-gritty of it. And so it's only a very small part of that. And if developers in your organization are just saying like, our developer portal, and that's like our Swagger docs, then you can go and say, no. I heard differently, Kristof told me. That's not how it works. There's a lot more to it. Because a developer portal can be an interface for your API strategy. Like a lot of businesses are doing this major initiatives. Like we all need to become like Amazon. We all need to change our organization, become much more agile. We need to look at all the resources that we have inside of our organization and how they could be used by other people. And we need to put APIs in front of that so that we can reuse those and maybe find new products that we didn't even know that we could be building based on what we've already invested in. And so I would argue that a developer portal can become kind of like the interface for these programs. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's also the communication nexus of all of these people. And when I do this talk or something similar as part of an API strategy talk that I do for companies that want to invest in a developer portal, a lot of them don't know. Well, a lot of them don't have developer evangelists. Often they don't know what that is. And often they don't have documentarians either. They have documentation people somewhere else in the organization, but nobody has joined the API team yet. So one of my core messages always going to these organizations is like, you need to think about evangelists and documentarians. You need at least one of them in your team to help with documentation, because developers can write API references, but the other documentation probably, yeah. You could say no, but I would say they need some help. Yeah. And then the last one, I think a developer portal is also a little bit like this. Have you ever wondered why banks have this kind of facades? Right? Like it's crazy. They spend a whole lot of money on this, and it doesn't really do anything except for making people feel like this is solid. It's not going to go away. They spend a whole lot of money on this, and I'm sure it's not going to go, bankrupt, or God forbid, my money is going to disappear. I think the same thing you could say for a developer portal. If it looks crappy, then is this API going to be around? How invested is this organization in their API effort? When I make this integration, is it just going to disappear and I'm going to be like standing there having to do a new integration with something else? So I think that a developer portal can be a very powerful and important trust signal that tells people like, you can trust us. We've done our work. We've done all our guides. We're not just this is not a bevlieging. Oh crap! It's not. That was a Dutch word. Normally I don't do that just now. It's not something that we're just going to abandon just on a whim. It's not a whim. That's what I was looking for. So, and what is then developer experience? I don't know. Had you heard about developer experience before today? Some people. Okay, but about 1/3. Okay. That's what DX comes from, developer experience. It's like UX, user experience, but for developers. So developer experience, for me, it's the journey of the developer through the use of an API, starting from not knowing about an API all the way through to troubleshooting and telling your friends about it. For me, it's like a viral loop. It's like at least I think you should try to make it a viral loop, where people discover your API, then evaluate it and say like, well, this looks kind of good. Start using it, they troubleshoot it, and then celebrate it. For a lot of organizations, as I said before, they just focus on the reference documentation, and that's only the troubleshooting part. There's a really important part for the discovery. So like a lot of there's this meme in the developer community. Developers hate marketing. I think I would like to correct that a little bit. I think I believe that it's that developers hate manipulative marketing, which is a very different thing than marketing. I think there's good forms of marketing where you're informing about your product and how it compares to other products, and you know everybody likes that because you need it, because without that you can't use a product. So I don't think that it's a good thing to just shy away from marketing. I think that a developer portal can have an important role for marketing to help your organization. It also needs to help developers evaluate an API. If you require people to trust you before they can learn to trust, if you require people to trust you before you trust them, that's kind of a problem. What I mean is like if you require people to give payment credentials and their credit card details before they can get an account, there's a big chance they won't use your API. So there's a couple of tricks that you can do to let people try out an API before they actually really commit to it. And it's probably good to look at that, and that's a really important part of like the flow, is like how easy is it to get started with you know, just looking around, kicking the tires, maybe using a mock API or something like that. And then the next step is like, okay, I know I want to use this API. Now, how do I really get started? And then you really need tutorials. A lot of portals don't have tutorials. I'll talk a little bit more about the role of SDKs and tutorials and explain what SDKs are later. But I think that every portal should have at least a few tutorials to explain, or at least, you know, if you can explain the investment, I think you should have tutorials. Troubleshooting, we talked about that. There's a few other components to that in terms of community support and community tooling that you could build, and then celebrating. And this is the parts for the viral thing. If you can celebrate somebody making an app using your API, so that they can go and tell their friends, like, hey, I did this cool thing with this payment gateway, and you know, it actually was really fun and easy, and maybe other people will start using API. But what does that mean practically? Because this is a technical writer event, and this was all strategy and business stuff, mostly. Maybe some developer evangelism, best practices. We did this research. This is the research that Kathleen worked with me on, one of my colleagues, where we looked at a bunch of different developer portals, and we analyzed like what kind of documentation were they using. Kind of the best of breed developer portals. Well, okay, I'm not claiming that those are the best developer portals, but not, you know, the crappy, we just threw some Swagger into Swagger UI and we're fine portals, but like more fleshed out, portals that people were talking about and saying that they're actually good and that they provide good experiences. And from that, we distilled a couple of different types of documentation, including reference docs, but beyond that also, that were used across the different portals that we looked at. The first one was overview pages. And you say, overview pages, is that even docs? I would claim that overview pages, they're kind of in the gray area between marketing and docs, but they also fulfill a role in documentation because, like, when you're trying to convince people that they're going to use, if they should use your product, you need information about your product. And like you can say, we're the greatest, we're the best, and whatever. But I think it's much better to talk from like, you know, the functionality and the benefits that people will gain from it, and more the features probably if you're talking about developers. The overview pages also help a lot with the navigation and with helping people find where they can find the different types of documentation and how it all fits together. Here comes one of the big questions and big problems when you're doing a developer portal is, so how are we going to structure our docs? Hopefully you're not doing it just by type of documentation, because that's not really the best. I think that there's three patterns of information architecture that we've seen that are better than that. And which one, like, depends a little bit on your product and how many APIs you have and how it all fits together, how many communities you're serving, what version of architecture you should be using. But in short, I think there's like, you could organize by language, meaning like your audience that you're trying to reach with your APIs. You could organize by product if you have a lot of products. You have to be very careful here because a lot of people just have this wall of APIs and often with names that don't mean anything, Amazon, and it can go very easily wrong. And what a lot of the best portals I've seen grouping APIs into like categories that make sense and that are used together and that mean something for the developer that is going to be using an API. And then the last one is like by objectives. I think probably there's like the mixture, if you have a lot of APIs between these two, that makes the most sense. Ultimately though, as I said before, your information architecture is not just something you should just do and then forget about it. Like you probably should be checking your information architecture and testing different ways of organizing your docs to create the best possible experience. You know the Ice Bear book? Yeah, right. So I think the key is one size fits all does not work, not with docs. Next is onboarding pages. What does that mean? And here you can see that this is a very new field. Right? This is one of those pages that's very ambiguous. Like I'll have another one next. Because like, what is the difference between overview pages and onboarding pages? But we saw, or Kathleen saw, consequently that people were making that distinction between those two. Or that there was like an overview page, that was like the landing page for the portal, and then you had like an onboarding page. That was a separate page. Now the interesting thing here is that you'll often find, because, how to say it, like often these pages linked to two different areas with two different objectives. Because as I said earlier, in the journey, you have the evaluate and the getting started part. And some developers that just want to get started. They don't care about evaluate. Like, you know, they already know that they want to use your API, or they just want to hack around a bit and see if it works. Like you might have decision makers that come in or project managers or team managers that go and look at API documentation to see, like, does this thing do all the things that we need it to do, or will there be problems down the road? Are there certain feature sets that we need that are not part of this API but maybe of another one? And because of that, I think that these pages are kind of like a choose your own adventure pages, where you can, like, depending on what you're trying to do, if you're evaluating or getting started, of course you don't say that, but like having like a API, well, links to different sections of your documentation that can help with that. This is the other one that's super ambiguous. Guides and tutorials. Is that the same thing? Not? Yes? No? It's very, very mixed, and everybody's using it differently. There's no standard understanding about what is the difference. There's some attempts, I'll show you in a moment, but it's a little bit mixed. And like, there's a lot of overlap between the two. Even when people make the distinction between the two, they'll still use them in overlapping fashions for more or less the same reasons, which is kind of weird. Twilio does this separation where they say, and I think I've got it here. Yeah. So where they say that guides show problems that your product solves. So they're to some extent, they're tools for onboarding purposes, but they're also actually helping with evaluation. So they're pretending like, hey, I'm going to explain you how to use this thing, but actually they're explaining a few important use cases of a product, of an API, and help people to that are like, so what do I do with this thing anyway? To find out really quickly, oh, that's an interesting story, and oh, now I get it. Tutorials is more the, okay, now show me how to do this thing, and like to really get started. But again, I don't know if you agree with me. Feel free to disagree. This is the distinction we made. It's part of the white paper that we published about this. We've looked at a bunch of different things, and this is a distinction we did. Next, SDKs. Who knows what is an SDK? Okay, well, quite a lot, yeah. Some people call it libraries. So like, if you don't know what it is an SDK, it stands for Software Development Kit. It's like an implementation of your API contract in a bunch of different languages. So that if you're a developer, you don't have to go and create the bindings of an API to your specific language on your own. So it saves time, but it also has a couple of other benefits. So SDKs, first of all, of course, help with developments. But I think one of the key hidden benefits is that SDKs help with best practices. And this is something that a lot of people often overlook, is that, what kind of objects should you use in a certain language to call a certain API. Maybe you have two API calls that actually fulfill a function that's very similar, and actually they should be together in one function in the client library. But maybe there were technical reasons why you had to have them separate in your API. So there's a couple of things like that allow you to create a better experience and to make sure that developers won't step into obvious black holes when they're starting their implementation. Yesterday, this is a really crappy picture from a slide. Well, I zoomed it out. Yeah, it's. I was trying to make my own picture, but it was too slow. There was this talk yesterday by Tristan, who talked, and it's cool. He even had like the Western tune, the the whistling, and he talked about how they use SDKs at Stripe, and it was very interesting because a lot of people that I've heard talk about SDKs, they talk about, they basically agreed that you should not generate SDKs. And he was saying that they're generating all their SDKs. It was like, huh. The reason why they're doing that is because they want their SDKs to always be in sync with their API. They release something new, it automatically gets updated, and the functionality is available right away. And they can't. And his argument was that they can't just go and hire one developer for all these different languages that's going to be constantly updating their SDK. The thing is that I personally adhere more to Keen's perspective on SDKs. Keen is an analytics tool. It allows you to gather data. So it's like a measurement tool, basically. And they do something really interesting because they have official SDKs. They call them, that's interesting. Because there was okay. This screen is okay. Now it's back? Okay. yeah. Don't go too far. So they make that distinction between official product SDKs and community SDKs. And community SDKs are basically somebody in their garage wrote an integration for our API and it's kind of good, so we put it on our websites, and we don't take any responsibility for this, so it might be out of sync. And the product SDKs, the official SDKs, are we endorse these SDKs and we've made sure that they're okay and that they're, that they're maintained properly. Now the interesting thing is that they work with community. They work with the different communities that are out there to maintain and to create the SDKs. So if there's somebody who's using their API to create an SDK and their work is done well, and it's a sizable market for them, then they'll go and contract them to maintain it and to keep using it. So they solve the problem of having to hire a developer for all these different languages that way. And that's really interesting. But it doesn't solve the problem if your API is evolving all the time. Like if you have daily or weekly releases, they're not going to keep up with this. So there's, I think, a third way, and this is new insight from yesterday, especially for you. I was talking with Cristiano Betta and Nicola from the Write the Docs community, and they said that you can also do this, which is you have the auto-generated library, and then you put on top of that like a best practice layer. I don't think they call it like this, but it's like the layer where you use this first layer to then do all these things like combining APIs into objects and stuff like that, and to make the library much more, in tune with the developer language for which it's going to be used. Because if this was something that the guy Tristan from Stripe said, was that some people will say like, this Perl library looks an awful lot like your JavaScript library. It's like, yeah, because we just generated, and I think this solves that problem. And then you can have the best of both worlds, because I think and this is the new insight. So I think that you could do community designed, so working with the communities, handcrafted for that top layer, and still generate it so that you have automated updates, and then have the best of all these worlds with an SDK that's best in class. Probably we need some tooling. There's no tooling for that yet, as far as I know, but maybe somebody in the room here sees a calling and wants to solve this problem. Another thing, and this is again more applicable for this audience, is that Taylor Barnett from Keen, she talks about how your onboarding tutorials should be written from the perspective of your SDKs. So don't just do a general onboarding, how to use my API, but talk about onboarding in a specific language, using a specific SDK, which is going to make things much easier, because else they have to, like, you know, you don't want to make developers think and abstract things into their own language. Maybe they're kind of new even in their field. And so you want to make that as easy as possible. Like if you have a composer or something like that, maybe you want to explain how to get the package. Yeah. The next point, the next type of documentation is the API reference. Like for a lot of people, the API documentation. And it's true that API reference should be part of your docs MVP, like your minimal viable product. There was a question I got, I think it was at an unconference at Write the Docs. It's like, so what should your API documentation MVP look like? And I was like, well, I don't know. Probably a bit of a mixture. I think you definitely need API reference, because without, you know, people will get lost and there won't be a way to find out what is there, because it's, yeah, without the API reference, you can't use an API basically. There's some people that do that though. It baffles me, but they do exist. Places where developers are like, you know, use our API, and there's not even a reference. It's hard. It's kind of like shooting in the dark. So I think that's really important. But then I think you probably also need a short introduction of what your API is for, and then probably some tutorials. Although that, if you really don't have money and there's really no time, then maybe you can skip some of those things. So probably a docs MVP for APIs should be API reference plus a short description of what an API does, I think. But you know, if you have different opinion, please do tell me. In terms of what format you should use, because there's different formats for API documentation, this is the most popular one. You probably know it as Swagger. There's been some really weird thing where the specification that used to be called Swagger suddenly became something else, and then a company started using the Swagger brand, and it's kind of messed up. I don't really know what happened, but it's now the Open API initiative. Yeah, it's interesting because in my view, there were three main standards that were kind of like modern and that were vying for world domination. One was this one, Open API Swagger. The other one was API Blueprint, and the other one was, and the third one was RAML. Now, API Blueprint, the company that was that's pioneered that, got bought by Oracle, and then I love those guys. They're really, really nice team. Apiary, they had this really interesting API design product. The thing is that in the press release of the acquisition, they were only talking about API management and no longer about API design. And I think that's the end. I don't know. I still need to talk with them about it, but no, yeah. And then the third one is RAML. RAML is a standard that was pioneered by MuleSoft, and they just joined the Open API Alliance. So I think that I think we know the winner. I think it's this one. Also, most tools are built for this. There's a lot of open source tools to publish Swagger and Open API, and do a lot of interesting things with it, like testing documentation, and so on. One thing that I see, or that I've heard from other people also, is there's this really big pain point. It's like, how do you combine your OpenAPI generated documentation with your other documentation. Your problem? Yeah, okay. So, because most organizations use static sites are really popular, and Jessica can tell you a lot more about that. Like the way that most people are doing it is, they just generate them separately and they interlink them, and that's it. But it's not enough. So what we've been doing with this, and this is where, or why I think it could be useful to have a CMS like Drupal for publishing your docs, is that you might want to import your Swagger file into like a native format and then mix it with your other documentation. And I think this is one of the things that's why it would be good to use a tool like Drupal. The other thing is when you want to prevent access to your documentation. I know we don't really like doing that because there's SEO reasons why it's a good idea to have open documentation. But a lot of the enterprise customers we work with have APIs that can't be public. And for them, it's important that they can prevent access from certain APIs. Like you could have a separate Swagger file or separate portal, but if you have different partners, and it becomes very messy. And I think this is another reason why it can be useful to use a CMS instead of a static site generator. But it's like a small, it's an important case for use case for enterprise, but less for most API teams. Because then you can do role-based access control. Last there's one more. Fifth is support resources. There's a whole lot of them. It's kind of a zoo. It's the same as with tutorials and guides. What is the difference between frequently asked questions and knowledge bases? Often it's just answers to questions and structure. Yeah, I think key probably is that when you do an FAQ, you want to make it very simple and have very few questions, so that it becomes very digestible. Maybe you have different categories so that people can go to a page with like the most important questions for that specific area. But then you want to have search or, like you definitely don't want to have like an endless list of questions and then go and find what question you had, or that's not very user friendly. Then for knowledge bases, I think it's important to have like a table of contents. Icons can also help to some extent. My colleague digged a bit more about this in her research. And then community. This is a bit of a pet peeve because a lot of people, they're like, oh yes, let's do community, free support. No, that's not how it works. When you're going to make a community section on your site, you probably need someone you need someone who's going to be managing that, who's going to be answering questions. You probably need to seed it with content and just so that it's not like an empty portal or an empty forum. Like this is, we've seen this a lot, or I've seen this a lot, is like either it's completely empty or it's full with spam. And that's not really good. Then it's better not to have a community section. On the other hand, if you do it well, it can be very powerful, and it can be a good way to integrate a community of integrators or consultants that are using your API or that are integrating it into different products, and to expose them to potential customers. And that's good for your product because it creates an ecosystem, and a community section can help with that. But again, it's a lot of work. Don't underestimate it. The other thing is that the thing you definitely need to do is to go where the developers are going. GitHub and Stack Overflow are not optional. You need to be monitoring, you need to be looking at what people are doing. It's not easy because there's so many places, But yeah, it might also be useful to have maybe even tech writers helping with monitoring that and answering questions there. And then, yeah, if you're enterprise, you definitely need support. You need to do more than this even. So DX is a lot of work. And yeah. Now, and that brings me to like a question, because what about internal APIs? Because if you have a large organization and you're trying to do the Amazon thing where, you know, you've just your CEO has just said that everybody who doesn't have an API for their resources is going to get fired, then you definitely need to also have developer experience in-house. And because it's so much work to do developer experience well, this often doesn't happen. I've talked with people at telecom companies where they have a team that just does a workshop to help explain how to use an API. They don't have real documentation. They're just doing it on the fly, or they're relying on developers explaining to other developers. It's kind of scary. It increases your buzz factor a lot. The buzz factor, if one developer goes away, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. So it's I think a big problem. And this is something that I've been thinking about because we are working with a company, and they have this big API initiative that they're doing, where they want to like get the whole organization to start using web APIs. And so I was talking with them about like, so how are you going to do your developer experience? How are you going to do your documentation for all these different initiatives? Because you don't want to have a single central unit that's doing it for everybody. That's just not going to work. It's not scalable. And that's where the second developer journey comes in. And I think this is the upstream, what I call the upstream developer journey. And it's something I haven't seen anybody writing about it. It's like kind of like the warehouse of your API, where all the different endpoints that you have in your organization are like in one central place with at least some basic documentation about what they do and the Swagger or the OpenAPI spec about for the reference docs, and hopefully maybe a few other things. So unless the organization is going to hire a whole lot of technical writers and have a whole bunch of documentation being written all over the organization, probably, and this is something that we're now experimenting with, probably you'll need developers to be, oops, it's okay, I'll just do this. Ta-da, no, ta-da. Almost. Ta-da! No. Wait, there it's back. It's going to come. Yep. Ta-da! Thank you. So what we're trying out now is to create a sort of a gamification thing where we're going to have an overview page with all the APIs and then a 5-star rating of how well they're documented, and to basically kind of get management to start saying like, oh, I've got 20 APIs and they're all 4 stars, or like, why is this a 1-star? So that you can have a bottom-up effort to get more documentation done. And then probably you still need tech writers to do at least the editorial aspect of the documentation, to like just do a review, look at the content architecture, and things like that. But yeah, so this is something that we're experimenting with. Not sure. It's back there. So, yeah. We're almost at the end, so hopefully. I call this Upstream DX. And that was the end of this talk. I don't know how we're doing on time. Yeah. That's good. So, questions?
I have a mic,
Yeah.
but I think we can hear each other. Do you want to use the mic, or do you guys just want to stand up and ask questions? Yeah, good call. Okay, mic it is. So, we'll start here.
Oh, no? Okay. Yeah, so mine is really more of a comment than a question, but I actually am the owner of a developer portal, and one of the things that I think is the biggest win for our community that wasn't mentioned here is the ability to try out the software in a sandbox type of environment. And I noticed even our hosts have that on their website where you can try out the merchant experience in advance. And so I took notes about your list, but I think that the ability to try maybe is something you might consider.
We haven't done any research about it yet. I'm looking at a few tools that are doing that. There's a Katakoda in London, and the owner of that startup has been presenting at our meetup. So there's definitely something that I'm looking at. But because we haven't done the research yet, I didn't want to add it yet. But it's also it's a good point. So, okay.
which is
developer.servicenow.com.
Okay.
In regards to your research of the developer portals out there, can you speak personally to any design patterns you're seeing that work really well as the structure of those portals change in terms of tutorials, API guides, knowledge base, onward?
It really depends. Because if you have a very focused product and you have only a few APIs, then it's much easier because then but if you have 100 APIs and it's kind of a mess, it's much harder. So it really depends. That's why I said that it's an information architecture problem, and you probably need to work with an information architect or a UX designer to figure that out and to do some workshops around it.
I'm going to quickly ask everyone from PayPal to cover their ears for a second. Would you still consider the Stripe API docs to be the industry leading example, or is there something else that's become, you can take your hands off now, is there something else that's become the one that people refer to the most?
People are still talking about Stripe a lot. So they're still talking a lot about them. Yeah. But there's other Braintree is often mentioned, actually. Yes, that's true. I've heard, so both payment gateways. Twilio is often mentioned, although that they've added a lot of new APIs, which makes it more complex and harder to look through. I really like what Keen is doing, Keen.io. They're also really present in the community. I like their thinking about SDKs a lot. There's no clear leader, I feel, or there's no one set of best practices yet. It's all very much up in the air. It's all changing really fast. Like with the sandboxes, that's something that now suddenly everybody's talking about. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, but there are also, like for API documentation, I've been working on how to start teaching API documentation, and I've really struggled with that because, I can work with groups like internal groups and get developers to sort of follow what I'm doing. Once they see how I've changed their documentation, they start to imitate it.
Yeah.
because they're trying to one up me.
Yeah.
And I, it's like, how can this writer like do a better job of writing about my stuff?
Yeah.
And so they get angry and they start really trying to prove that they're better than me anyway. And I'm like, yeah, right.
Which is probably good, right? Because,
It's really good. It's exactly what I want to see happen. And I've been laughing with one of my managers about some of the wars that have started to try to prove one thing or another. And I'm working with two different groups that try to one up each other sometimes. So it's fun. But, to really teach, I've really struggled, and I actually gave a presentation that I think didn't go very well through Write the Docs.
Yeah.
It's like I'm still struggling, but I started to come up with some ideas about like the improving API reference.
Yeah.
So I does anybody want to hear one of the key things? It might not make any sense, but it's point of view.
Yeah.
As point of view, because when you're working with layers of networking, the developers get confused about what point of view they're supposed to be writing from.
Yeah. Interesting.
And so I started to realize that in order to teach, I think that's one of the main things to focus on in improving API reference.
Very
And
interesting.
it took me years to realize that a lot of what I unsnarl is point of view.
That's often not. Like with documentation, it's almost always like about domain language. It's so important. And with developers, that's definitely a big problem. Also, naming can be problems because of that.
Naming can be, there are lots of different things that show up. So all of those, and it can be completely different with a new group that you're working with. They might have a completely different set of problems in their documentation. So anyway, but
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
No mention of GraphQL?
Yes. We're going to have a presentation about how to document GraphQL at API the Docs in London. By the way, if you're... Yes, sir? Yeah, we will. We will. So, on to the 20th of June, we're doing API the Docs in London, which is an event specifically about API documentation, where it's a bunch of people from all over the world, I can say, flying in to talk to explain like how to do API documentation well, Jessica amongst others. So and we're talking from Shopify. We'll have somebody talk about GraphQL. So yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This is maybe more of a tools question. So I also own a developer documentation portal, but we don't have a CMS, and we desperately need one because we've got these disparate things that are, it's just not effective. So with the tools, you've clearly landed on Drupal. And I know that there's other things like Akina and things like that they might be a little heavier than what I might need. But as far as taking something like, we've got stuff in JavaDoc, we've got stuff, built out in AngularJS, we've got static HTML. What tools are powerful enough? And we've also got some homegrown stuff. What tools are powerful enough that we can take those different sources and really kind of quiz them, art them into? This is for,
I'm a Drupal guy, and I can't help it.
No, and I'm fine with, if the answer from you is Drupal, that's fine with me.
Also like Apigee, which is one of the biggest API management companies, they use Drupal for their developer portal, their first portal was built in Drupal. Now they have like a simplified portal also. So we do a lot of work with them, and this is how we really got started because of that relationship. I personally, and even looking from outside, I think Drupal is a really good tool for this purpose, especially if you have some of the other problems like the access permissions. Like if you have that problem, then then it's definitely interesting. What we basically do is we just suck in all the documentation from whatever it is. We've done Java doc import, we've done Dita import, we've done Markdown. We're currently working on a Drupal 8 portal because Drupal 8 is a newer version of Drupal. So that's not finished yet, but we started building now for customers. I think there's a lot of good things in Drupal. There's very strong content modeling. So it's a little bit like Dita. Okay, and without the XML stuff. But like you can create content types and add fields to them and like have very structured information. Add categories, do faceted search so that you can say like, do versions and all of that stuff. That's all there. It's very powerful for it. Now, there's other CMSs. Some people are using WordPress. WordPress is less. Oh, okay. WordPress is bigger community. So, but it has a much weaker content model. They've been doing a lot of work to improve that. But it's still pages as a first thing. Like pages come first, and then you can do also other things. In Drupal, this field model and this topic-oriented model is like a primary thing, and that's all through the system. That's now several generations ago that we did that. So it's very powerful, and you can do all kinds of things like views and make listings of different things. So. Is that the best thing? I don't know, but if you're interested, I'm happy to connect about it. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you, in your research, I know there were a bunch of standout, like very focused sites that only had like a handful of products, and so it's really easy to have a good UX. Were there any standouts for like a very like large number of APIs or products that they're managing?
I don't know. I think probably with the number of APIs Twilio has been adding, I think they're probably, although I'm still get a bit confused when I look at their site now. I don't have a real answer, not at this point. Yeah. It's maybe we need to answer that question. That's a good question. Yeah. So, sorry. Other questions?
So, excuse me. I was thinking, what's your opinion and thoughts about API and revision handling, given that normally let's say you're working at a company that we drop once a month new revisions. A contract by its nature needs to be solid and not change over time. Yeah. But at the same time, you want to develop, increase, make it bigger, and correct parts of your interface descriptions. How do you handle that? Because the release cycle might be very different from the product itself.
So I think Stripe is doing versioning really well. I've seen this now in several of their presentations where they talk about like having backwards compatibility almost forever. If you need a new feature, you need to upgrade. And they have like, if you're on an old version, they'll say like, do you want to upgrade as part of the docs? I think the key is that I've seen a lot of docs where they have problems with versions because they have like one single version of their docs. That's like the canonical thing. So, and what we've done in several occasions is have tagging per version so that you can then filter down and see like, this is an older or a newer version. So you definitely need something like that. In terms of forcing everybody to follow ahead, that depends a bit on your business model and how mission critical your API is also, I think. If you're a LinkedIn or a Twitter, you probably can dictate what people should be doing. if these are paying customers, you probably can't. So it depends. Again, it depends. Yeah.
So just to follow up to that, because versioning is kind of an issue for what I'm doing, and there's V3 and V4, and then there's new parameters that come in different versions. And right now we're just doing one doc. This is V3, this is V4. We're kind of at a beginner stage. But in terms of tagging, is that something you would only be able to do in the Drupal version that you're talking about, or are there different tools? We have a very simple, we're just using Joomla right now. It's very simple. I can't do very much with that, but I was wondering what your...
I'm sure other tools can also do tagging. The question is how do you tool it? I think one of the simplest thing is to have a different Swagger file per version, and then just tag those with a version, and then have you have some content duplication, but that's the simplest to do. I don't know. I haven't seen people doing tags inside of Swagger. Probably you could do something like that. I don't know. So maybe something like that might help. But I haven't seen that actually. Yeah.
Hi. So I have a question. It's kind of a follow-on question to the one that you had. I'm at a startup that's got a number of portals from previous companies that have all come together. And we have an API portal that seems to be working. However, I've been tasked with going out there and deciding on what kind of overreaching training portal that's going to have everything live in it: documentation, training, APIs, customer-facing things. It'll be behind a login, so it's for customers and partners. And I'm searching tools right now. Yeah. They're using WordPress, and you referred to that. I think you said it's not necessarily very robust for that type of use.
It depends what you want to do.
Sorry again?
It depends what you want to do. So WordPress is a good tool. It's a very good CMS. You can't argue with so many users. They're humongous. The thing with it is that it really is, even though that there's that addition of these content models, it still is more like a blog or like a simple page thing. Right. So you can import content, like you can import Swagger into WordPress. Like you can import OpenAPI spec into WordPress and have like a listing of your API endpoints. But it's like, as far as I know, it's going to be a flat list. So it's going to be one object that loads in the one page. And I don't know if there's already like deeper integrations. What we are doing now in Drupal is making a deep integration so that you can have every endpoint as its own thing in the database, and then you can do things like tagging, and you can do access permissions and all of that stuff, which normally I don't think that exists in WordPress yet. Everything is possible, right? It's also,
Sure. It seems like it's really grown a lot since its early blogging use.
So it's definitely a good tool. We are choosing Drupal because it's more mature for advanced use cases, and there's it's like we're a consultancy. It's also WordPress developers are often a lot cheaper. So the competition is very different. It's also not differentiated. So in WordPress, you'll have one-man armies or one-woman armies doing whole sites from design all the way to backend. And often quality is damaged by that, as we've seen. And that doesn't mean that WordPress itself is bad. It's a very different ecosystem. We like the Drupal ecosystem more because it's more enterprise-like. It's more differentiated. Like we have front-end developers, we've got like site builders that do the click work, and then we have developers that do the backend work. And that's like I know that there's some of the leading WordPress agencies also have those differentiations, but in Drupal that's kind of common. In WordPress that's not as much.
Right.
So does that mean it's a bad tool for your documentation? Not necessarily. Depends what you want. If you want to do like a deep integration, you want to have like a more granular search, and you want to tie everything together, then I think probably Drupal would be better, or at least when we're going to be done. If you just want to publish a bunch of things and just have it like, as long as it gets online, it's fine, then maybe you don't even need a CMS. Then probably a static site would be fine. Although, the access permissions, that's another thing.
I think I'm looking for something that's kind of in between. And sorry for making this completely self-serving, but it's related.
No, I'm sure a lot of other people are interested.
I'm sure a lot of people at startups are encountering the same exact thing. I think I'm going to do the content management, the CMS, outside of that world. I want to just use this as a delivery mechanism, and also where customers can get their docs and all the other things, or people can access the APIs and that. I just think it's something in between I'm looking at. Just by chance, have you ever heard of anything called Ready Portal?
Ready Portal? No.
Sounds like Portal in a box. I think they're out of Canada, Ontario. They're very small though, so it's a scary thing.
There's plenty of other tools. There's readme.io also.
But, that's where our APIs are at. Readme.io.
So there's plenty of tools. The question is, if it sounds like you have a lot of APIs, so probably you're a larger organization,
not
or
yet.
Not? Okay. So if you have very complex requirements in terms of access permissions, I don't know. Personally, I really love open source. I love being able to download my software and host it myself if I have to.
Sure.
If you're tied into a SaaS tool,
Yeah, I think that it being a startup, there are limitations as to resources we have behind us, like engineers to help with the back end and that kind of thing. That's going to be a real deciding factor in what I go forward with. But I appreciate your comments.
So, well,
research,
hope it helps.
More research.
So I'm going to cut off questions for now, but if you've got more questions, I'm sure that Kristof would be happy to answer them. And so we can have a little networking time after the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to do one last shout out. It is a little bit self-serving, but we are very, very nice and gentle with. So we have a mailing list where we publish once a week a news, an article or something that we've found somewhere about API documentation specifically and about developer portals. It's also where we talk about our new Drupal product. As I said, we're very, very gentle with the list, so we don't do crazy spamming. We won't be harassing you. I might reach out, but I think you've seen I don't bite. But if you're interested in that, just go to that URL, sign up. If you're not sure you're going to do that, I've got a paper where you can put your name and email address, or you can give me cards, and then I'll put you on the list. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Don't worry. It's probably, I don't know, maybe connection thing or...
Sorry, I'll let you chat with it. It's not fun, but I loved it just because I love the idea of having the stars with you and
cool.
My star, my internal development.
The information architecture book that was part of your slideshow.
Yeah.
Was that a good book?
It's like the book. So it's I read it a long time ago. I read it a long time ago, and I learned a lot from it. So it's definitely a good place to start. But it's like the Bible of information architecture. So Everybody knows it. It's like the Ice Bear book. Everybody. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. No.
I'm a developer. So maybe it's on the website. It's on the, what is the product that you consult or like do we mention do we post it? Like just to understand more
Currently, we do a lot of work with their portal, their so they their last year was just so if you want that's what they do. For them, the optimization is like something they know that they have to and for a long time they did it themselves. And there's started to see so a lot of our work right now is just so that you know that is if you're a lucky customer, that's what that is. But if you're not,